October 15th, 6 o'clock. Hours. Black Ridge National Forest, Sector 4. The silence woke me up before the sun did. I've spent half my life in the wilderness, first as a ranger with the 75th, then as a survival instructor for civilians who want to play soldier for a weekend. I know the rhythm of the woods. I know the morning chorus. At 6 o'clock in the Pacific Northwest, the forest should be waking up. You should hear the Stellar's jays screaming at each other in the canopy. You should hear the rustle of squirrels on the pine needles, the distant chitter of insects warming up in the first rays of light. But there was nothing, no birds, no wind in the Douglas firs, no scuttling in the underbrush, just a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against my eardrums like deep water. I lay in my sleeping bag for a long moment, just listening. My hand instinctively moved to the Glock 19 tucked inside my boot by the tent door. It's a habit I never broke after 3 tours in Afghanistan. You don't sleep without steel within reach. My breath plumed in the cold air, hanging above me in the gray light filtering through the rainfly. The temperature had dropped overnight, probably hitting the low 30s. It was cold, but this was something else. The air felt static, charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks, but the sky outside was clear. Mark? A groan from the other sleeping bag. What time is it? I sat up, the tension in my shoulders not easing. 6 o'clock. Go back to sleep, Dave. David rolled over, clutching his phone like a lifeline. Even out here, 40 miles from the nearest cell tower, he checked it every morning, hoping for a stray signal. Freezing, he muttered, his voice thick with sleep. Why do we do this again? We have a perfectly good house with a thermostat. Because you spend 12 hours a day looking at spreadsheets, and your blood pressure is higher than Dad's was, I said, unzipping the bag. The sound was deafening in the quiet. You need the detox. I need coffee, he countered, shivering as he sat up. And Wi-Fi. I think I'm going through withdrawal. David was 28, 6 years my junior, and soft in all the ways civilization makes you soft. He worked in IT, lived in a condo in downtown Seattle, and thought roughing it meant a hotel without room service. I dragged him out here for a 5-day deep hike to try and reconnect. We hadn't been close since the funeral, since I came back from overseas a different person than the brother he remembered. He wanted the old Mark back. I was trying to show him that the old Mark was buried in the Kandahar dust, and this was who I was now. A man who needed the silence of the trees to keep the noise in his head quiet. But this silence, this wasn't right. I unzipped the tent door and crawled out into the clearing. The air smelled sharp pine resin, damp earth, and something else. Faint, metallic, like copper left out in the rain. I stood up and scanned the perimeter. We were camped on a ridge overlooking the Black River, about 10 miles from the trailhead where we'd left my truck. The view should have been majestic, a sea of green rolling hills disappearing into the mist. Instead, it felt like a stage set, empty, waiting. I walked to the edge of the clearing, my boots crunching softly on the frost. I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. Not a leaf, not a branch. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, terrified to make a sound. Coffee? David stumbled out of the tent, wrapping his puffy jacket tight around himself. He looked pale, dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't been sleeping well out here. The quiet freaked him out. Yeah, I said, keeping my voice low. Get the stove going. I'm going to filter some water from the creek. You okay? David paused, looking at me. He knew that look. The ranger look, he called it. The 1,000-yard stare I got when I was processing a threat assessment. Fine, I lied. Just quiet this morning, weirdly quiet. Maybe the animals are on strike, he joked, but his laugh was nervous. He felt it too. The primal part of his brain, buried under years of latte art and coding languages, was screaming that something was wrong. I grabbed the water bladder and my rifle, a Remington 700.308. Bolt action, reliable, hits like a freight train. Overkill for a hiking trip, David had said. Essential survival gear, I'd argued. There are bears in these woods. Cougars. and two-legged predators that are usually the most dangerous thing you'll find. I slung it over my shoulder and headed down the game trail toward the creek. The woods were dense here, a mix of old-growth cedar and thick ferns that came up to my waist. Usually, I'd move through here checking for track deer, elk, maybe a black bear. Today, I was checking sight lines. My body was reacting before my mind caught up, heart rate elevated but steady at 80 beats per minute. Hands loose, eyes scanning in sectors. I was patrolling. Why was I patrolling? I reached the creek, a fast-moving tributary of the Black River. The water was clear, tumbling over gray stones. I knelt on the bank, unscrewing the cap of the bladder. That's when I saw it. About 20 yards downstream, something blue was caught in a snag of driftwood, not a natural blue. Synthetic. I capped the bladder and stood up, unslinging the rifle. I moved along the bank, stepping carefully on the slick rocks. As I got closer, the shape resolved. It was a boot, a hiking boot. But not just any boot. It was a Danner Tachyon, the same model issued to some of the park rangers in this district. I reached the snag and pulled it free. The boot was laced tight. The laces were double knotted. Nobody takes off a boot and double knots it. I looked inside. There was a foot inside, severed at the ankle. The bone wasn't cut cleanly. It was jagged, splintered. The flesh around the tear was ragged, as if it had been pulled apart by massive force. There were teeth marks on the leather upper. Human teeth marks. I dropped the boot. My hand went to my radio on my belt, a habit from a life I didn't live anymore. No team, no comms. Just me. I looked at the water swirling around the driftwood. There was a thin ribbon of color mixed in the foam, pink. Diluted blood. I scanned the opposite bank. The ferns were trampled. A path of destruction led from the water up into the tree line. Mud was churned up, exposing the dark roots. And there was blood. Not a few drops. A lot of it. Bright red arterial spray painted across the trunk of a cedar tree. "Mark?" David's voice drifted down from the ridge. "Water's boiling." I didn't answer. I crossed the creek, jumping from rock to rock, ignoring the icy water that splashed over my boots. I needed to see what made that trail. I needed to know what could tear a man's foot off and leave teeth marks in leather. Bear? No, bears maul. They swipe. They don't gnaw like that. Not on boots. I moved up the bank, following the blood. The smell was stronger here, that copper tang mixed with the ammonia stench of fear sweat and bowels. The trail was erratic. Whoever or whatever had come this way had been stumbling, falling, crawling. Handprints were smeared in the mud. I crested a small rise and froze. In a small clearing of crushed ferns, a man was leaning against a fallen log. He was wearing the tattered remains of a National Park Service uniform. His gray shirt was soaked dark with blood. His pants were shredded. One leg ended in a bloody stump wrapped crudely with a belt acting as a tourniquet. He was alive, but barely. I lowered the rifle but kept it ready. "Ranger," I called out, my voice commanding. "Identify." His head snapped up. The movement was too fast, jerky. His face was a mask of blood and dirt, but his eyes were wide, terrified. The pupils blown so wide the irises were just thin rings of brown. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering with a sound like dice in a cup. "Don't," he wheezed. His voice was wet. "Don't go back." I closed the distance, scanning his immediate area for threats. No bear, no cougar, just him. I knelt beside him, keeping a 3-foot gap. "I'm Mark. I'm a medic. Let me look at you." He grabbed my wrist. His grip was shocking. Like iron. His hand was burning hot, fever heat radiating through his tactical glove. "Listen," he hissed, spittle flying from his lips. "The trailhead. The lot. It's a slaughterhouse. They're waiting." "Who's waiting?" I asked, trying to pry his fingers off my arm. "Who did this to you?" "The campers," he whispered. A tear cut a clean line through the grime on his cheek. The family in Site 4, they'd just started screaming. And then, oh God, the sound, the crunching. He was delirious. Septic shock maybe. Or blood loss. I looked at his leg. The tourniquet was tight, but the stump was oozing black fluid, not red. Black, thick and tar-like. The veins running up his thigh were dark, tracing a spiderweb pattern under his pale skin. I need to stabilize you, I said, reaching for my med kit on my belt. My brother is up on the ridge. We have a satellite radio. We can call for a medevac. The ranger laughed. It was a horrible bubbling sound. Radio is dead. Satellites are silent. Nobody's coming. I called for hours. He started to cough. Deep, hacking coughs that brought up dark clots of blood. He convulsed, his back arching off the log. Easy, I said, putting a hand on his chest to steady him. His heart was hammering against his ribs. It felt like a bird trapped in a box, beating so fast it was just a flutter, 180, maybe 200 beats per minute. That wasn't possible. His heart should have exploded. "David," I yelled over my shoulder, abandoning stealth. "Get the kit. Get down here now." The ranger's coughing fit subsided, but he didn't relax. He went rigid. His entire body locked up, his muscles bunched under his skin, visibly spasming. "Seizure," I muttered, moving to clear the area around him so he wouldn't hurt himself. "Hang in there, buddy." But this wasn't a normal seizure. His head threw back, hitting the log with a sickening crack. His mouth opened wide, wider than a jaw should go, the ligaments popping audible. A sound tore out of his throat, not a scream, but a high-pitched, rattling inhale, the shudder. That's what I'd call it later. A violent, full-body vibration that blurred his edges. Then I heard the bones. Pop, crack, snap. His spine arched so severely I thought it would break. His shoulders dislocated with a wet thud, rolling forward in their sockets. His fingers curled into claws, digging into the bark of the log until his fingernails tore off. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, backing away. I've seen men die. I've seen IEDs turn Humvees into coffins. I've seen the human body destroyed in 100 ways. But I had never seen a body rearrange itself. The ranger stopped moving. He slumped forward, his head hanging loose. Silence returned to the woods. I stood there, rifle raised, heart pounding in my throat. Ranger? Nothing. Mark. David came crashing through the ferns, sliding down the muddy bank. He was holding the orange first aid box. "What happened?" "I heard you yell." He stopped when he saw the man. "Oh my God. Is he dead?" "Stay back," I ordered, not looking at David. My eyes were locked on the ranger. "David, stay back. He needs help, Mark. Look at his leg." David took a step forward. I said stop. I barked. The ranger's head lifted. It wasn't a slow, groggy movement. It was a snap, mechanical, instant. His eyes were open, but the brown irises were gone. The pupils were gone. His eyes were milky white, covered in a film like cataracts, but red veins pulsed across the surface. Blood leaked from his tear ducts, tracking black lines down his face. He looked at David. He didn't look at him. He looked through him. He looked at him like a wolf looks at a deer. No recognition. No humanity. Just hunger. "Run," I said. The ranger lunged. He didn't stumble on his missing foot. He didn't cry out in pain. He launched himself off the log with impossible force, clearing the 6 feet between them in a blur. He hit David in the chest, tackling him into the mud. "Get off," David screamed, thrashing. "Get off me." The ranger, the thing, was on top of him, snapping its jaws. The sound of its teeth clacking together was like stones banging. It wasn't trying to punch or choke. It was trying to bite. It buried its face in David's puffy jacket, tearing at the nylon. Feathers exploded into the air like snow. I didn't think. I reacted. I dropped the rifle, too close range, too much risk of hitting David. I drew my knife. A Kabar fixed blade. 5 inches of carbon steel. I kicked the ranger in the ribs. It felt like kicking a bag of wet cement. He didn't even flinch. He just kept tearing at the jacket, working his way toward David's throat. "Mark!" David shrieked, his hands pushing uselessly against the ranger's shoulders. I grabbed the ranger by the back of his tactical vest and yanked. He was heavy, unnaturally dense. I hauled him backward, pulling him off my brother. He spun in my grip. He didn't turn like a man. He twisted like a snake. His hand, the one with the torn fingernails, clawed at my face. I ducked, feeling the wind of the swipe. He grabbed my jacket, pulling me in. His face was inches from mine. The smell was overpowering, rotting meat and copper. His mouth opened, blood-stained teeth gnashing. A drop of black saliva hit my cheek. It burned. I drove the knife into his side, aiming for the kidney. The blade went into the hilt. He didn't make a sound. No grunt of pain. No shock. He just kept snapping at my face, driving me backward. "Die!" I shouted, twisting the blade. Nothing. He was a machine. A biological machine set to kill. I let go of the knife and slammed the palm of my hand under his chin, driving his head back. It bought me an inch of space. I brought my knee up, smashing it into his groin, a move that drops any man. He didn't react. He grabbed my throat. His grip was crushing. My windpipe compressed. Black spots danced in my vision. I was going to die here. I was going to be strangled by a one-legged dead man in the middle of nowhere. The head, a voice in my brain whispered, "It's the only way." I reached down to my belt, fumbling for the Glock. My fingers brushed the grip. I ripped it free. I jammed the muzzle under his chin, pushing through the soft tissue until it hit bone. I pulled the trigger. Crack! The sound was deafening. The ranger's head snapped back. A mist of red and black sprayed into the air. His grip on my throat instantly vanished. He collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, falling heavy onto the mud. I stumbled back, gasping for air, clutching my bruised throat. I scanned the body. Half his head was gone. He wasn't moving. Finally, "David?" I rasped, spinning around. David was scrambling backward through the mud, crab-walking away from the corpse. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide, staring at the thing. You shot him. You killed him." "He was trying to eat you, David," I said, my voice rough. I walked over to him, grabbing his arm and hauling him to his feet. "Check yourself. Did he bite you? Did he break the skin?" I don't know." My jacket. David looked down at his ruined coat. The down filling was leaking out, covering the blood-soaked mud. "He was crazy. Mark, he was crazy." "He wasn't crazy," I said, holstering the Glock and retrieving my rifle. I walked back to the body. I needed my knife. I pulled the blade from the corpse's kidney. The blood on the steel was black, thick. It didn't look like human blood. It looked like oil. I wiped it on the ranger's pants and sheathed it. "We need to go," I said. "Now." "Go where?" David stammered. "We need to call the police. We need to wait here." "No," I said, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him. "Look at him, Dave. Look at his eyes. Look at the veins. That's not a crime scene. That's a biohazard." And he said there were more. "More?" He said the trailhead was a slaughterhouse. He said they're waiting. I looked at the ranger's belt. He had a radio. I knelt down and unclipped it. It was slick with slime. I turned the volume knob. Static. Just white noise. "Ranger dispatch. This is..." I paused. I didn't even know what to call myself. "This is a civilian emergency. Officer down in Sector 4. Do you copy?" Static. Then, a voice, cutting through the hiss, not a dispatcher. A recording. "Emergency alert system. Biological containment breach reported in. Widespread panic. Do not approach. Lethal force authorized." Repeat. "Lethal force authorized." The signal cut out. "Lethal force," David whispered. "Mark, What is happening? I don't know, I said, clipping the radio to my belt. But we are not going back to the truck. If the trailhead is compromised, we need an alternate route. I looked at the map in my head. We were 10 miles in. The nearest logging road was 4 miles east, over the ridge. It was rough terrain, but it would bypass the main parking lot. Pack your gear, I ordered, switching into the mode that had kept me alive in the sandbox. Compartmentalize, focus, execute, essentials only. Water, food, socks. Leave the tent. Leave the stove. Leave the tent? David looked at the campsite like it was his bedroom. Mark, it's freezing. Move, David, I shouted. He flinched, then nodded, scrambling up the bank toward our camp. I stayed by the body for a second. I looked at the ranger's face. The remaining eye was still open, staring milky white at the canopy. I checked his name tag. Miller. Sorry, Miller, I whispered. I stood up and looked around the woods. The silence was gone. In the distance, from the direction of the city, from the direction of the highway, a sound drifted on the wind. It was faint, rolling like thunder, but sharp. Pop, 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 pop. Gunfire, then a deeper sound. A dull, heavy thud that shook the ground beneath my boots. An explosion. I looked east. Above the tree line, a column of black smoke was beginning to rise, staining the pristine blue sky. It was thick, oily smoke, the kind you get from burning fuel. Burning tires, burning cities. My hand shook slightly as I gripped the rifle. I clenched my fist to stop it. David, I yelled. We're moving out. Right now. I turned back to the trail of blood the ranger had left. It led back into the deep woods, back toward where he came from. Whatever this was, it wasn't just here. It wasn't just a sick animal or a crazy man. The smoke on the horizon told me everything I needed to know. The world hadn't just changed, it had ended. And we were 10 miles from nowhere, with a pocket knife and a hunting rifle. I took a breath of the cold air. It tasted like ash. Day one, I whispered to myself. I turned and ran up the ridge. The silence of the forest was broken now, replaced by the sound of my own heart hammering a war drum against my ribs. We were on our own. We scrambled up the loose shale of the ridge, boots sliding on wet rock, breath tearing at our lungs in the cold morning air. I could hear David behind me, his breathing ragged, bordering on hyperventilation. He was making too much noise gasps that sounded like sobs, the clatter of his boots kicking stones loose, but I didn't stop to correct him yet. We needed distance. We needed to put verticality between us and the corpse of Ranger Miller. Down in the creek bed, my mind was already racing through the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act cycling faster than I could consciously process. Observation. The threat is biological, highly aggressive, and capable of ignoring fatal trauma to non-critical areas. Orientation. We are 10 miles deep, low on supplies, and the primary extraction route is compromised. Decision. Evacuate via the eastern logging road to avoid population density. Action. Move. Move fast. We breached the tree line and stumbled back into our campsite. It looked exactly as we'd left it 10 minutes ago. The tent fly flapped gently in the breeze. The stove was still hissing quietly, the water in the pot boiling away into steam. It was a snapshot of a peaceful morning that felt like it belonged to a different century. Pack, I ordered, my voice flat. I moved to the fire pit and kipped dirt over the stove, killing the flame. David, snap out of it. Pack your bag, now. David stood by the tent entrance, staring at his hands. They were shaking so violently he couldn't unzip his jacket pocket. Mark, his face. It was gone. You shot him and half his face was just gone. I grabbed him by the shoulders, hard enough to bruise. I needed to shock him back into the present. David, listen to me. That wasn't a man anymore. That was a threat. And there are more of them. If we stay here, we die. Do you understand? We die. He looked at me, his eyes glassy. The reality of it was struggling to seat itself in his brain. It was too big, too impossible. But the fear was there, primal and sharp. He nodded. A jerky, puppet-like motion. Okay, pack. Water, food, socks, layers. I listed, moving to my own ruck. I dumped the non-essentials. The camp chair, gone. The extra fuel canister, kept one, tossed two. The paperback book I brought, gone. Every ounce mattered now. Leave the sleeping bag. Leave the tent. If it doesn't keep you alive or moving, it stays. I worked with mechanical efficiency, stuffing protein bars and freeze-dried meals into the outer pockets of my mystery ranch pack. My hands were steady, but my chest felt hollow, like someone had scooped out my insides with a melon baller. I kept seeing Miller's eyes, that milky, dead white, the way he had moved fluid, snapping, wrong. It wasn't the slow shuffle of a George Romero movie. It was the twitchy, adrenaline-fueled violence of a rabid dog. I checked the ranger's radio clipped to my belt again. I turned the squelch down and held it to my ear as I packed. National Guard units are falling back to the I-5 corridor. Repeat, all units fall back to static. Overrun at Providence Hospital. They're coming through the vents. Oh God. They're click. Shoot on sight. Any individual displaying hemorrhagic symptoms or aggression is to be considered hostile. Do not attempt to restrain. Do not attempt to treat. The voices were terrified. These weren't calm dispatchers managing a crisis. These were people watching their world end in real time. Mark, David said. He was holding his laptop case. My work, the backups. I snatched the case from his hand and threw it into the tent. Are you insane? It's dead weight, Dave. The cloud doesn't exist anymore. The internet is gone. Put on your rain shell and get your boots tied tight. Double knots. He looked at the laptop case, then at me, and for a second, I saw the grief hit him, not for a person, but for a life. The realization that the spreadsheet, the conference call, the quarterly review, it was all dust. He turned away and started stuffing socks into his pack. I did a final weapons check. The Remington 700 held 4 rounds in the internal magazine. I had a box of 20 in my pack. 20, 4 shots, not enough. The Glock had a 15-round magazine, -1. I had 2 spare mags on my belt, 44 rounds of 9mm. It sounded like a lot until you remembered how fast Miller had moved, how little he had cared about a knife in his kidney. Ready, David said. His voice was small. Drink, I ordered, handing him the water bladder I'd filled earlier. Hydrate now. We don't stop for the next hour. He drank, water spilling down his chin, then we shouldered our packs. I took point. Stay 5 paces behind me, I instructed. Watch the tree line to the left. If you see movement, you don't scream. You say contact left. If I say run, you run. You don't look back. You don't wait for me. You run until your legs give out. Clear? Clear, he whispered. We left the campsite behind. We left the tent standing, a nylon tombstone for the weekend that was supposed to fix our relationship. We headed east, away from the river, pushing into the dense timber of the ridge. The terrain here was brutal. No trails, just game paths woven through thickets of salal and devil's club. The underbrush tore at our pants. The ground was uneven, a lattice of roots hidden under rotting cedar needles. I set a punishing pace. I needed to burn the shock out of David's system. I needed to get us to the high ground before we intersected the logging road. For the first mile, the only sound was our breathing and the snap of twigs. The forest was still unnaturally quiet. The birds hadn't returned. It was as if nature itself had gone to ground, sensing the predator in its midst. I kept the radio on low, an earpiece tucked in my left ear. The chatter was getting worse. Seattle is burning. The fires are out of control. Fire crews cannot respond. Sector 6 is lost. My kids. They took my kids. This is Corporal Mendez, 2nd Battalion. We are combat ineffective. We are out of ammo. We are, oh Jesus, here they come. I didn't share this with David. He was struggling enough just to put one foot in front of the other. I could hear him muttering to himself, a low mantra of panic. It's not real. It's not real. It's a dream. Wake up. Quiet, I hissed over my shoulder. Sound travels. We crested the first ridgeline after 40 minutes of hard climbing. My thighs burned, a familiar, grounding pain. I signaled for a halt and dropped to one knee, scanning the valley below through the scope of my rifle. The Black River wound through the valley floor like a silver snake. To the west, where the sun should have been brightening the sky, a haze of brown smog hung heavy over the hills. Smoke. Look, I said, pointing. David came up beside me, bracing his hands on his knees, gasping for air. He followed my finger. Columns of black smoke rose from the horizon, thick and oily. They weren't coming from the forest. They were coming from the towns along the highway. Kyellum, Ellensburg, maybe even further out. It looked like the sky had been bruised. Is that the city? David asked. That's civilization burning, Dave, I said grimly. That smoke means structure fires, no fire department, no containment. It's all going up. But the army, David started. They have plans for this. They have protocols. The radio says the guard is falling back, I told him, deciding he needed the truth now. False hope was a liability. They're overwhelmed. This moved too fast. Miller said the trailhead was a slaughterhouse. Think about how many people are in the woods this weekend. Campers, hikers, hunters. All of them packed into parking lots and campgrounds. David paled. The families, the kids. Targets, I said. Biomass for the infection. I stood up. We need to reach the logging road. It connects to the fire service roads. If we can get to the ranger station at Shadow Lake, there might be a vehicle. Or at least a landline. Shadow Lake is 10 miles away, David said. Then we better start walking. We pushed on. The sun rose higher, but the light was filtered through the drifting smoke, casting the woods in a sickly amber glow. It felt like walking through a sepia photograph. The air grew warmer, but the smell of copper and rot seemed to linger, ghosting around us whenever the wind shifted. We hit the logging road around 8 o'clock. It was a scar of gravel and mud cut into the side of the mountain, overgrown with alder saplings. It hadn't been used by trucks in years. It was wide, exposed. I didn't like it. I preferred the cover of the trees, but we needed speed, and the brush was slowing us down too much. Stay in the drainage ditch on the uphill side, I ordered. Low profile. If we hear an engine, we dive into the brush. We moved along the road for another mile. The silence was broken only by the crunch of gravel under our boots. I kept scanning our six, checking our back trail. Nothing followed us. Yet. Then, around a bend in the road, the radio crackled with a signal that was terrifyingly close. Any unit. This is. Trapped in the watchtower. They're climbing the. Please. The voice was young. Female, and it was breaking up, not because of distance, but because of signal obstruction. Did you hear that? David asked. It heard the static hiss from my belt. Local traffic, I said, checking the frequency. It was a forestry channel. Someone nearby. We have to help them, David said, stopping. Mark. If they're close, we don't know where they are, I said, keeping my pace. And we don't have the gear to mount a rescue. We keep moving. But, contact front. I dropped to a crouch, pulling David down with me into the ditch. Ahead of us, about 400 yards down the logging road, figures emerged from the tree line. I brought the rifle up, settling the crosshairs. My scope was a loopholed 39x variable. I cranked it to max magnification. There were 4 of them. Hikers. Bright-colored rain jackets. North Face yellow. Patagonia red. They were moving fast, running down the center of the road toward us. "People," David whispered, clutching my arm. "Mark, look, they're survivors. We can warn them." I watched them through the glass. They were running, yes, but they weren't running away from anything. They were running in a pack. Tight formation. And their gait, it was wrong. Too fluid. Their arms pumped aggressively. Their heads were up, scanning. One of them, the one in the yellow jacket, tripped. He hit the gravel hard. A normal person would scramble up, check their knees, look back at what was chasing them. This man didn't. He bounced off the ground like a rubber ball. He was back on his feet in a microsecond, not breaking stride. And then I saw the face. Through the scope, at 300 yards, I saw the jaw hanging slack. I saw the red smear covering the front of the yellow jacket. I saw the eyes, white. "They aren't survivors," I said, my voice cold. "They're running right at us. Maybe they saw us." David started to stand up, waving his arm. "Hey, over here. Get down." I grabbed his ankle and yanked him back into the ditch, but it was too late. The lead figure yellow jacket stopped instantly. The other three slammed to a halt behind him. They stood perfectly still for a heartbeat, heads cocked. Then, all four heads snapped in our direction. A sound drifted up the road, a shriek, not a scream of fear, a scream of discovery. It sounded like metal tearing. "Runners," I whispered. "Dave, get up, we have to go back into the woods." "Now." "Are they?" "Yes, move." We scrambled out of the ditch and crashed into the uphill tree line. The brush here was dense thimbleberry and vine maple. It was a nightmare to move through. Behind us, the gravel crunched. Rhythmic, fast. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They were sprinting. "Go, go, go." I shoved David ahead of me. "Don't worry about noise, just speed." We tore through the undergrowth. Branches whipped my face, stinging like lashes. I could hear David panting, a high-pitched wheeze. He was panicking. He was going to trip. "They're coming," David screamed. I risked a glance back. Through the gaps in the leaves, I saw flashes of yellow and red. They were off the road. They were in the brush. And they were fast, much faster than us. They moved through the obstacles like water, diving over logs, smashing through vines. They didn't care about pain. They didn't care about injury. They were closing the distance. 100 yards, 80. "Head for the ravine," I shouted, checking my mental map. There was a steep drainage about 200 yards north. If we could get down the slope, maybe the loose terrain would slow them down. David snagged his foot on a root. He went down hard, face planting into the dirt. "Get up," I roared, spinning around. He scrambled, trying to find purchase, his eyes wide with terror. "I can't, my ankle." I looked back. The lead-infected yellow jacket was 30 yards away. He burst through a wall of ferns, his face a mask of gore. He wasn't even winded. His mouth was open, black veins pulsing in his neck. He saw us. He let out that chittering, wet hiss and accelerated. I didn't have a choice. I planted my feet, shouldered the Remington and exhaled. The world narrowed down to the crosshairs. The yellow jacket filled the scope. Center mass. No, head. Miller had taken a bullet to the brain to stop. The target was bobbing, weaving. A headshot on a sprinting target at 20 yards in dense brush? Low probability. I aimed for the pelvis. Break the structure. If he can't run, he can't kill. I squeezed the trigger. Boom. The recoil kicked into my shoulder. The sound was apocalyptic in the quiet woods. It slapped against the trees and echoed back, a thunderclap that would tell every living and dead thing for 5 miles exactly where we were. The bullet hit Yellow Jacket in the right hip. The impact spun him around like a rag doll. He went down, his leg folding at an impossible angle. He hit the ground, but he didn't scream. He didn't grab his leg. He immediately began to crawl, dragging his shattered lower half, clawing at the dirt, pulling himself toward us with demonic strength. "Move, David," I racked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing. It spun through the air, smoking. I chambered a fresh round. The other 3 infected were right behind him. They didn't stop to check on their fallen packmate. They leaped over him. One of them, a woman in a torn fleece, launched herself off a stump. I fired again. Boom. I missed the head, hit the shoulder. The round blew her arm off. Red mist sprayed the ferns. She tumbled, hit a tree, and bounced back up. One arm gone, blood spurting, still running. Jesus Christ, I whispered. Pain meant nothing to them. Shock meant nothing. David was up, limping, terror lending him speed he didn't know he had. We reached the edge of the ravine. It was a steep drop, maybe 60 degrees, covered in loose shale and mud. Slide, I yelled. We threw ourselves over the edge. It wasn't a controlled descent. It was a controlled fall. We slid, tumbled, and crashed down the slope. Rocks tore at my hands. Mud filled my mouth. I kept the rifle clutched to my chest, praying I didn't bend the barrel. We hit the bottom in a tangle of limbs and gear. We were in a narrow creek bed, shadowed by towering rock walls on either side. The air was cold and damp. Quiet, I hissed, clamping a hand over David's mouth before he could groan. Don't make a sound. We lay there in the mud, frozen. Above us on the ridgeline, gravel scattered. I looked up. The silhouettes of the 3 remaining infected appeared at the edge of the drop. They stood there, looking down. The woman with the missing arm was dripping blood onto the rocks below. Drip, drip, drip. They were scanning. Their heads jerked back and forth, twitchy, bird-like movements. They were listening. David's breath was hitching against my palm. I pressed harder, staring into his eyes, willing him to be silent. If you scream, we die. The infected on the ridge let out a low moan. It was a questioning sound. They couldn't see us through the dense canopy of the ravine floor. They had lost the visual. Now they were hunting by ear. One of them took a step down the slope, dislodging a stone. The stone clattered down, bouncing off the rock wall. Clack, clack, splash. It landed in the creek near my boot. The infected's head snapped toward the sound of the splash. It crouched, ready to spring. I slowly, infinitely slowly, moved my hand to the Glock on my belt. The rifle was too long, too awkward for this range. If they came down, it would be hand to hand. Minutes stretched out. My muscles burned from holding the tension. A drop of sweat rolled down my forehead and stung my eye. I didn't blink. The infected on the ridge waited. They were statues of violence. Then, in the distance, back toward the logging road, a sound echoed. A siren. It was faint, miles away, probably a police cruiser or an ambulance speeding down the highway in the valley. But in the acoustic bowl of the mountains it carried. Whoop whoop. The infected heads snapped up. They turned toward the sound instantly. The siren triggered them. The noise drew them like moths to a flame. With a collective shriek, they turned and sprinted back the way they came, disappearing from the ridgeline in seconds. I let out a breath I'd been holding for 5 minutes. I took my hand off David's mouth. He gasped, sucking in air, trembling so hard his teeth chattered. They, quote, they don't stop. You blew her arm off and she didn't stop. They hunt by sound, I whispered, holstering the Glock. My hands were shaking now. The adrenaline dump was hitting me. Sight is secondary. Sound is primary. Did you see that? The rock fell. They looked. The siren started. They ran. We made noise, David said, his voice cracking. You shot the gun. It was so loud. I had to, I said. But you're right. That gunshot probably drew every one of them within 2 miles to our position. We can't stay here. I checked the rifle. The scope was caked in mud. I wiped it with my thumb, grimacing. We need to move downstream. The water will cover the sound of our footsteps. We stay in the ravine. Mark, David grabbed my sleeve, my ankle. I think I twisted it. I looked down. His left boot was at an odd angle. Can you walk? It hurts like hell. Can you walk? I asked, harder this time. He gritted his teeth. Yes. Good. Because crawling is too slow. We started moving down the creek bed. The ravine was a scar in the earth, deep and shadowed. It felt like a trap, but it was also a shield. The walls hid us. The water masked us. As we walked, I pulled the radio off my belt again. I needed to know what was happening out there. I needed to know if there was anywhere left to run. I turned it on, keeping the volume barely audible. The static was thicker now. The voices were fewer. Seattle perimeter has collapsed. The bridges are blown. I repeat, the bridges are blown. Do not attempt to cross Lake Washington. Ed, containment failed at SeaTac Airport. It's a horde. Thousands of them. They're on the runway. And then a new voice. Clearer. Stronger. This is Sergeant Vance, 1st Special Forces Group. We are establishing a rally point at the Alpine Outpost on Mount Rainier. Any military personnel, any survivors with tactical capability, push to Alpine. We are holding. I repeat, we are holding. Alpine Outpost. That was 40 miles south, a straight shot through the wildest, most rugged terrain in the state. But it was a destination. It was a plan. Did you hear that? I asked David. Alpine. He nodded. That's far. It's hope, I said. We trudged on. The sun passed its zenith and began to dip toward the west. The light in the ravine turned gray, then blue. The temperature dropped. We were exhausted. We were hungry. But we didn't stop. Around 16 o'clock, the ravine opened up into a wider valley. The woods here were different, older, darker. The trees were massive, blocking out the sky. And there was a smell, not the copper smell of blood. This was worse. This was the smell of burning plastic, jet fuel, and cooked meat. Do you smell that? David asked, wrinkling his nose. Yeah. We moved forward, creeping through the ferns. I spotted it through the trees. A clearing, or what used to be a clearing, now it was a crater. In the center of the blackened earth lay the twisted wreckage of a helicopter. It wasn't a civilian chopper, it was a Black Hawk. Military, it had come down hard. The tail boom was snapped off, the main rotors were shattered, shards of composite material stuck in the tree trunks like shrapnel. Smoke still curled from the fuselage. Is that rescue? David asked, hope warring with horror in his voice. Stay here, I ordered. Cover the rear. I moved toward the crash site. My boots sank into ash. The heat was still radiating from the metal. I approached the cockpit. The glass was gone. The pilot was still strapped in, or what was left of him. He had burned. But the co-pilot's seat was empty. The harness was cut. I scanned the ground. Boot prints led away from the wreck. Drag marks. Someone had survived. Someone had crawled away. I moved around to the cargo door. It was jammed open. Inside, crates were scattered. Green metal crates stamped with hazard symbols. Biohazard. Level 4. One of the crates was cracked open. Vials lay broken on the deck floor. I felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I reached in and grabbed a clipboard hanging from a cargo net. I flipped through the manifest. It was soaked in hydraulic fluid, but legible. Cargo, sample 893B. Origin, Seattle Virology. Destination, Yakima Training Center. Priority, Alpha. Sample 893B, I whispered. This wasn't a rescue chopper. This was a transport. They were moving the virus, or the cure, or the weapon. And it had crashed right here, in the middle of the woods. Mark. David's voice was a harsh whisper from the tree line. Movement. I dropped the clipboard and spun around, raising the rifle. At the edge of the clearing, where the drag marks led, A figure stood up from behind a stump. It was wearing a flight suit. One arm was hanging by a tendon. Its face was burned, the skin peeling away in black flakes. The co-pilot. He stood there, swaying. He let out a moan that bubbled through his ruined throat. Then he saw me. He didn't ask for help. He didn't ask for water. He shuddered. That violent, bone-popping convulsion, and then he started to run. Toward me. I brought the rifle up. "Welcome to the party, pal," I muttered. The echo of the gunshot rolled through the valley, a dinner bell for everything hungry in the dark. And the sun was setting. Day one was ending. The real nightmare was just beginning. The gunshot died, but the ringing in my ears didn't. It hung in the damp air, a high-pitched whine that masked the return of the silence. I stood over the body of the co-pilot, the brass casing from my rifle still smoking in the mud a few feet away. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt loud enough to give away our position to everything in a 5-mile radius. I didn't look at his face, what was left of it. I looked at his flight suit, United States Army, 160th SOAR, Night Stalkers. These guys were the best pilots in the world. They didn't just crash into the side of a mountain unless something went catastrophically wrong inside the cockpit before they hit the trees. "Mark," David's voice was a tremulous whisper from the tree line. "Is he?" "I down," I said, my voice sounding flat, detached. It was the combat stress taking over, the emotional governor that shuts down the part of your brain that wants to scream so the part that knows how to reload can work. "Stay covered. Watch the perimeter." That shot was a dinner bell. I knelt beside the corpse. I needed intel, and I needed gear. I patted down the flight suit. No sidearm. He must have lost it in the crash or the crawl. I found a survival knife, a heavy serrated blade in a Kydex sheath. I took it. I checked his pockets. A signal mirror, a half-eaten energy bar, a laminated card with radio frequencies. I shoved it all into my cargo pocket. Then I turned to the helicopter. The Black Hawk was a ruin. The fuselage was cracked open like an egg, smoke drifting lazily from the engine housing. The heat coming off it was lessening, but the smell of burnt jet fuel and roasted meat was thick enough to taste. I climbed up the side, my boots slipping on the slick metal. I needed to see inside. If this was a biotransport, there were protocols, there were contingencies, and there might be a radio that could reach further than the handheld unit on my belt. I dropped into the main cabin. It was tilted at a 45-degree angle. Crates were scattered everywhere. The one I'd seen earlier, the one with the biohazard symbol, was just one of 6. 2 were smashed open, glass vials crunched under my boots. I held my breath, pulling my neck gaiter up over my nose. If this was airborne, I was already dead. If it was contact only, I just had to be careful where I stepped. The pilot was still in the right seat. He hadn't been as lucky as the co-pilot. The instrument panel had crushed his legs, and the fire had done the rest. He was a charcoal statue fused to the seat, but the console still had power. Amber lights flickered on the transponder. I squeezed between the seats, avoiding the charred remains of the pilot. I reached for the radio stack. It was military grade, encrypted, powerful. I plugged my headset into the jack, praying the internal battery hadn't shorted out, static. Then, a voice. Not the panicked local traffic I'd heard on the Ranger's radio. This was coming from high up. Maybe an AWACS, maybe a bunker. Sector 4 is compromised. Repeat, Sector 4 is black. All assets, initiate Protocol 0. Containment is no longer the objective. Sterilization is authorized. Sterilization. That meant firebombing. That meant they were writing off the entire region. I keyed the mic. Any station? This is a survivor at the crash site of Transport Blackhawk. Grid coordinate. I looked at the GPS unit on the dash. It was smashed. Grid coordinate unknown. Black Ridge National Forest, deep timber. We have civilians. We need extraction. Silence. Just the hum of the open channel. Then a new voice broke in. Cold, robotic. Unidentified station, state your status. Are you infected? Negative, I said, gripping the mic. 2 healthy males, 1 injured. We are at the crash site of the biotransport. The cargo is compromised. A pause, longer this time. Copy that. Hold position. A recovery team is inbound. Relief washed over me, so intense my knees almost buckled. ETA, we have hostiles in the area. We need hold position. The voice repeated, do not leave the cargo. Do not let the cargo be compromised further. Sterilization units are en route to your coordinates. My blood ran cold. Sterilization units. They weren't sending a rescue team. They were sending a cleanup crew. They didn't care about us. They cared about the vials on the floor. And cleanup meant erasing the mistake. Mark, David screamed. It wasn't a warning. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. I ripped the headset off and scrambled back through the cabin. Dave. I vaulted out of the cargo door, hitting the ash-covered ground hard. David was at the edge of the clearing, near the tree line. He wasn't alone. Something had come out of the ferns. It wasn't wearing a hiking jacket. It was wearing tatters of a lab coat. It was a woman, or it had been. She was small, emaciated, her skin gray and pulled tight over her skull. She was on top of David, pinning him to the ground. He was thrashing, kicking, screaming, holding her back by her shoulders. Her head was snapping forward, teeth clacking inches from his face. She was making that sound, the wet, chittering hiss of the infected. I raised the rifle. I couldn't shoot. They were thrashing too much. If I missed, the .308 round would punch through her and blow a hole the size of a grapefruit through my brother's chest. I dropped the rifle and drew the survival knife I'd just looted. I sprinted. It takes about 3 seconds to cover 20 yards when you're running on pure adrenaline. In those 3 seconds, I saw the woman's jaw unhinge. I saw the black saliva dripping onto David's cheek. I saw his eyes lock onto mine, pleading, terrified. She lunged down. David jerked his head to the side. Her teeth snagged the collar of his jacket, tearing the fabric. I hit her like a linebacker. I drove my shoulder into her ribs, knocking her off him. We tumbled into the ferns. She was light, impossibly light, like a bird with hollow bones. But she was strong. She twisted in my grip, her hands clawing at my face. Her fingernails were gone, worn down to bloody nubs from clawing at, what? The inside of a crate? The inside of the helicopter? She shrieked, a sound that vibrated in my teeth. She tried to bite my arm. I jammed my forearm against her throat, pushing her head back. Her eyes were milky white, swimming with black veins. Die, I grunted, bringing the knife down. I drove the heavy blade into the base of her skull. It crunched through bone and severed the brainstem. She went limp instantly. No twitching, no final gasp. Just dead weight. I shoved her off me and scrambled over to David. He was curled in a ball, clutching his leg, gasping for air. David, let me see. Did she bite you? I grabbed his jacket, ripping the zipper down. I checked his neck, his face, his hands. No, I don't think so. He was hyperventilating, his face pale as a sheet. She came out of the ground. She was under the log. I checked his collar. The fabric was shredded, but the skin underneath was unbroken. You're clear. You're okay. My leg, he groaned, squeezing his eyes shut. Mark, my leg. I looked down. His left ankle, the one he twisted earlier, was swollen to the size of a softball. He must have wrenched it again when she tackled him. I touched it gently. He screamed. A raw, ragged sound that echoed through the trees. It's bad, I said, my stomach dropping. It might be broken. Can you move your toes? I don't know. It burns. Oh God, it hurts so much. Tears were streaming down his face, cutting tracks through the dirt and ash. I looked at the sky. The sun was gone. The horizon was a bruised purple line fading into black. Night was falling. And we had just made a lot of noise. "We have to move," I said, grabbing his arm. "They're coming. The radio. The army isn't sending rescue. They're sending a bomb. We have to get away from the crash site." "I can't walk," David sobbed. "Mark, I can't. You have to leave me." "Shut up," I snapped, hauling him to a sitting position. "I am not leaving you. You're my brother. We go together." "I'm dead weight," he yelled, hitting his fist against the ground. "Do the math, Mark." "You always talk about the math. I can't run. If we stay together, we both die." He was right. The math was simple. A mobile survivalist can cover 3 miles an hour in this terrain. A man carrying a casualty covers maybe 1. The infected run at 15. The sterilization units were en route. The logical choice was to leave him, to give him the gun, and run. But the math didn't account for the promise I made to our mother before she died. "Take care of him, Mark. He's not like you." "I'm changing the equation," I said. I grabbed him by the belt and the collar of his jacket. "Get up." I hauled him to his feet. He cried out, keeping his left foot off the ground. I ducked under his right arm, draping it over my shoulders. I grabbed his wrist with my right hand and wrapped my left arm around his waist. "Lean on me. We're doing a fireman's carry if we have to, but for now, we hobble. We need to find cover. The ravine is too exposed. We need high ground." We started moving. It was agonizingly slow. Step, drag, step, drag. The woods grew darker with every minute. The shadows stretched out, turning into grasping fingers. The smell of the burning helicopter faded behind us, replaced by the damp, earthy scent of the deep forest. But now, the silence was gone completely. The woods were waking up. At first, it was just the wind. Then, the snapping of twigs, not the rhythmic crunch of a deer. The chaotic, stumbling noise of something that didn't know how to walk in the woods. Snap, crash, hiss. They were out there, not 1 or 2. The sound was coming from multiple directions. The city had emptied, the highways had clogged, and the people, the infected, had fled into the trees, or maybe they had been chasing survivors. Now, they were just drifting, hunting. "Mark," David whispered, his head hanging low, sweat dripping from his nose. "Do you hear them?" "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice low. "Keep moving, eyes down. Don't trip." We moved away from the crash site, heading south, toward a granite ridge I remembered from my training days. It was steep, difficult terrain, but that was the point. The infected were fast, but they were clumsy. They stumbled. They fell. Verticality was our only advantage. Night fell like a hammer. 1 minute it was dusk. The next I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I didn't dare use a flashlight. A beam of light in this darkness would be a beacon. We had to move by feel, by the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. My shoulders burned. David was not a small man, and his dead weight was dragging me down. My knees ached with every step. I was thirsty, hungry, and exhausted, but fear is a powerful fuel. Crack, a branch snapped, close. Maybe 50 yards to our left. I froze, clamping my hand on David's waist to stop him. We stood there, swaying in the dark, listening. A sound drifted through the trees. A low, rattling breath. Then, a voice. "Help me." It wasn't a zombie moan. It was a person, a woman. She sounded young. "Someone's out there," David whispered. "Mark, we have to." "Shh," I hissed. "Please," the voice called again. "I'm hurt. Is anyone there?" Then the voice changed. It pitched up, warping into a shriek. "Help me. Help me. Help me, help me, help me." It wasn't a plea. It was mimicry. Or it was the last firing neurons of a dying brain, looping a final thought. Then came the other sound, the wet crunch of impact, the tearing of fabric, the scream cut off abruptly, replaced by the chittering hiss of the infected. They got her, I whispered. Or she was one of them. It doesn't matter. Move. We pushed on. The terrain started to slope upward. The ground turned from soft pine needles to hard rock. This was good. Less noise. But the sounds behind us were getting louder. A chorus of moans and snaps. They had found our trail. They had found the helicopter. Maybe found the woman I killed. And now they were tracking the scent of fresh blood. David's ankle. My scraped hands. Faster, I urged, tightening my grip on David. I can't. He gasped. Mark, I'm going to pass out. You pass out. I drag you. You don't get to quit. We reached the base of the granite ridge. It was a wall of rock, jetting up about 50 feet before leveling off into a plateau. There was a narrow climber's trail, a switchback path etched into the stone. It was treacherous in the daylight. In the dark, it was suicide. But behind us, the forest floor was alive with movement. I could see them now, shadows darker than the night, moving between the trees. I saw the faint luminescence of milky eyes catching the moonlight. There were dozens of them. A horde. Up, I said, pushing David toward the trail. Hands and knees. Crawl if you have to. Mark, I can't climb. You climb or you get eaten. I shoved him. He scrambled onto the rock, dragging his bad leg. I came up behind him, planting my shoulder against his butt. Literally pushing him up the mountain. We made it 10 feet. 20. The wind picked up, howling around the stone face. It started to rain. Cold, stinging drops that turned the dust on the rocks into slick mud. Perfect. I muttered. Just perfect. Below us, the first of the infected reached the base of the cliff. They didn't stop. They didn't look up and calculate a route. They just slammed into the rock face. I heard the thud of bodies hitting stone. Then, the scratching. They were trying to climb. I looked down. In the gloom, I saw a pale hand reach up and grab a ledge. Then another. They were clawing their way up, driven by a hunger that defied physics. They slipped, fell, and started again. But some were holding on. Keep going, I yelled at David. Don't look down. We scrambled higher. My boots slipped on the wet rock. I scraped my knuckles raw. David was sobbing openly now, a continuous sound of pain and terror. We reached a small shelf, a flat area maybe 6 feet wide halfway up the cliff. It was a choke point. Rest, I gasped, collapsing against the rock wall. Just a second. David slumped beside me, clutching his leg. They're coming up. I can hear them. I crawled to the edge and looked over. They were coming. A slow, relentless wave of gray shapes inching up the rock. The rain slicked their skin, making them look like slugs. The leader, a man in a suit, his tie flapping in the wind, was 20 feet below us. He looked up, his eyes locked onto mine. He hissed, a sound that cut through the wind. I pulled the Glock. I had 2 magazines left, maybe 30 rounds. There were at least 50 of them at the base, and more coming out of the trees. Save the ammo, I told myself. Use gravity. I looked around the shelf, loose rocks, debris. I grabbed a stone the size of a cantaloupe. I leaned over and dropped it. It struck the suit-wearing infected in the face. He lost his grip and fell backward, taking 2 others with him. They tumbled down into the dark mass below. But 3 more took his place. It's not enough, David whispered. Mark, there's too many. I looked up at the rest of the climb. Another 30 feet of sheer rock to the plateau. In the rain, with a crippled man. Then I saw it. To our left, hidden in a fissure in the rock, was a dark opening. A cave mouth, or a mine shaft. It was small, barely 4 feet high. There, I pointed. Into the hole. A cave? David asked. We'll be trapped. We're already trapped, I said. At least in there we can bottleneck them. We can defend a narrow opening. Out here, they'll flank us. I grabbed David and dragged him toward the fissure. I pushed him inside. The air in the cave was stale, dry. It smelled of dust and something sweet. Like rot, but different. Old rot. I squeezed in after him, turning to face the opening. I drew the survival knife in my left hand and the Glock in my right. "Back up," I told David. "Get as far back as you can." "Mark." David's voice was strange. Hollow. I risked a glance backward. David had turned on his phone flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness of the cave. We weren't the first ones to find this hiding spot. The cave was small, a dead end maybe 20 feet deep, and in the back, sitting in a circle, were 4 people. A family. A father, a mother, 2 kids. They were wearing hiking gear. They were sitting perfectly still. The father had a revolver in his hand. It was resting on his lap. The back of the mother's head was gone. The kids were slumped against her, holes in their temples. The father had the gun in his lap, but the side of his own head was a ruin. It was a suicide pact. They had come up here, realized there was no escape, and made the choice. The smell was the bodies. They had been here for a day, 2, since the chaos started. No, the blood was dry but not ancient. This happened hours ago. "Oh God," David gagged, turning away. "Oh God, Mark." I stared at the grim tableau, the math of survival. The father had done the math. He had saved his family from the teeth and the turning. He had saved them from becoming the monsters climbing the cliff outside. Outside, a hand slapped onto the ledge of the cave entrance. Then a face appeared. Pale, wet, grinning with too many teeth. It hissed, staring into the cave. It saw us. It saw the fresh meat trapped in the stone box. It started to crawl in. I raised the Glock. "Back of the cave, David," I said, my voice trembling for the first time. "Get behind the bodies. Mark?" I said, "Move." I fired. The muzzle flash lit up the cave like a strobe light. The infected's face exploded. It slumped in the entrance, blocking the light, blocking the wind, but behind it, I could hear the others. Scrabbling, pushing. They were climbing over the dead one. They were coming in. I looked at the revolver in the dead father's hand. I looked at the Glock in mine. I looked at David, huddled behind a corpse of a child. We were in a tomb, and the gravediggers were knocking at the door. "Reloading," I screamed, though there was no one to hear but the dead. I dropped the empty mag and slammed a fresh one home. Day 1 was over, but the long night had just begun. The slide of the Glock slammed home, chambering a fresh round with a metallic clack that sounded like a judge's gavel in the confined space of the cave. I didn't have time to appreciate the mechanics. The dead infected I'd just shot, a man in a torn windbreaker whose face was now a crater of ruin, was slumped halfway into the entrance. He was dead, but he wasn't gone. His body was a plug, a dam holding back a river of gray flesh and snapping teeth. But the dam was leaking. Behind him, I could hear them, the wet slap of skin on wet rock, the scrabbling of fingernails against stone. They were pushing. The dead weight of the corpse shifted, inching forward as the pressure from outside built up. A hand, pale and skeletal, shot through the gap above the corpse's shoulder. It clawed blindly at the air, fingers hooking and unhooking, like the legs of a dying spider. "Mark," David whispered. His voice was thin, reedy, vibrating with a frequency of terror that usually precedes shock. "They're pushing him in." "I see it," I said. My voice was calm. It wasn't my voice. It was the voice of the training, the muscle memory that takes over when the conscious mind is screaming to curl up and die. "Keep the light steady. Don't shine it in my eyes. Shine it on the gap." The beam of his phone flashlight trembled, dancing over the wet limestone walls before settling on the horrific blockage at the cave mouth. The hand was joined by another. Then a face pressed into the gap. It was a woman, her hair matted with rain and mud. Her jaw was unhinged, hanging loose, but her eyes were locked on me. Milky white, pulsing with black veins. She didn't scream. She hissed, a sound like high-pressure steam escaping a valve, and shoved her head forward, trying to squeeze past the dead man's shoulder. I extended the Glock. The sight settled on her forehead. The math. Always the math. I had 14 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, 2 spare mags on my belt, 45 rounds total. There were at least 50 of them at the base of the cliff. How many were climbing? 10? 20? If I shot her, her body would just add to the pile. It might block the entrance further, or it might create a ramp for the next one. I lowered the gun. "David, give me the knife." "What?" "The knife. The one from the pilot? Give it to me." He fumbled in the dark, sliding the heavy survival knife across the stone floor. I grabbed the hilt. The rubberized grip felt good, solid. I stepped forward, closing the distance to the cave mouth. The smell hit me instantly, a concentrated wave of the copper blood scent mixed with the stale sweet rot of the dead family behind me. The woman hissed again, snapping her teeth. She was stuck, pinned between the rock and the corpse. I didn't hesitate. I drove the blade up, under her chin, into the brainstem. It was brutal, intimate violence. She seized, that violent shudder vibrating through the knife handle, and then went limp. I grabbed her by the hair and shoved her backward, out of the hole. She tumbled down the cliff face, taking 2 other climbers with her. I heard the wet thuds of their bodies hitting the rocks below. "Clear," I breathed, stepping back. For a second, I turned to look at the cave. It was a tomb. A literal tomb, the flashlight beam cut through the dust, illuminating the 4 bodies in the back. The father, the mother, the 2 kids. They were huddled together in a circle of Gore-Tex and tragedy. The father's hand was still resting on his knee, the revolver loose in his grip. He looked like he was napping, except for the exit wound that had turned the cave wall behind him into an abstract painting of despair. I moved toward them. "Mark, what are you doing?" David asked, his voice cracking. "Don't touch them." "We need ammo," I said, kneeling beside the father. "We need supplies. They don't need them anymore." It felt like a violation. It was a violation. But the rules of the old world died yesterday. In the new world, the dead are just resource caches. I pried the revolver from the father's stiff fingers. It was a Ruger GP100, heavy steel, 357 Magnum. I checked the cylinder. 6 chambers, 5 empty casings, 1 live round. He'd used 5 bullets. 4 for his family, 1 for himself. He'd saved the last one. Why? In case he missed? Or maybe he just couldn't do the math right in the end. I patted down his pockets. A speed loader. 6 more rounds. I dumped them into my pocket. 12 rounds of Magnum stopping power. It was a hand cannon. Loud, slow, but it would put a hole in an infected you could see daylight through. I checked the mother's pack. Water bottles, a bag of trail mix, a flare gun? No, just a standard road flare. I grabbed it. Red phosphorus. Burns hot, burns bright. It went into my cargo pocket. "Mark," David whispered. "The entrance." I spun around. They were back. This time, it wasn't a single climber. It was a surge. A mass of gray limbs and gnashing teeth slammed into the opening. They weren't climbing with technique. They were climbing over each other. A ladder of flesh. 3 of them were jammed in the opening now, fighting to get in. Not fighting us, fighting each other for the privilege of eating us. The noise was deafening. The hissing, the clicking of teeth, the wet slap of skin, it echoed in the small cave, amplifying until it felt like the stone itself was screaming. "Back!" I yelled at David. "Get in the corner." I raised the Glock. No time for knives now. They were pushing through. Bang, bang, bang. 3 shots, 3 flashes of light that seared my retinas. The lead infected, a teenager in a torn hoodie, took 2 in the chest and 1 in the neck. He didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. The hemorrhagic fever had rewired his nervous system. Pain was just information, and he was ignoring it. He crawled over the dead pilot I'd killed earlier, his hands reaching for me. His fingers were broken, bent at impossible angles, but they still grasped. Headshots, I reminded myself. Only the head. I adjusted my aim. The cave was small. The target was moving. My hands were shaking. Bang! The top of his head evaporated. He slumped forward. But the one behind him, a large man in a suit, the one I'd hit with the rock earlier, shoved the body aside. He squeezed through the gap, his shoulders scraping against the limestone. He was inside. He was inside the cave with us. "David, light!" I screamed. David swung the phone beam, blinding the infected man for a split second. The creature shrieked, shielding its eyes. They were sensitive to light. That was new intel. I didn't waste it. I stepped in and kicked him in the chest, driving him back against the wall. He swiped at me, his claws tearing through the sleeve of my jacket, grazing my forearm. I felt the sting, but I didn't look. I pressed the muzzle of the Glock against his temple. Bang. He dropped. "Reloading," I shouted, backing up. I fumbled for my second spare mag. My hands were slick with sweat and blood. Mine. Theirs, the pilot's. I dropped the empty mag. It clattered on the stone. I slammed the fresh one in. 15 rounds left in the Glock, 7 in the revolver, and the hole was filled again. They were endless. It was a conveyor belt of nightmares. Every time I killed one, the pressure from behind pushed another one forward. The bodies were piling up in the entrance, creating a barricade of meat, but the horde outside was tearing through it. I saw them pulling the dead bodies out, flinging them off the cliff to clear the path. They were problem-solving. Rudimentary, insect-like intelligence, but intelligence nonetheless. "We can't stay here," David sobbed. He was curled up behind the dead children, his face pressed into the dirt. "They're going to get in. We're going to die in here." I looked at the entrance. He was right. It was a war of attrition, and I was losing the math. I had finite bullets. They had infinite bodies. Eventually, my gun would click empty, or I would get tired, or they would just overwhelm us with sheer mass. And there was something else. The smell. The air in the cave was getting heavy. Toxic. The cordite fumes were burning my eyes. The stench of the open bowels of the dead infected was suffocating. I checked my watch. 21 o'clock hours. We had been in here for maybe 20 minutes. It felt like 10 years. "We have to move," I said. "Move where?" David looked up, his face streaked with tears and grime. "There's nowhere to go. It's a cliff." "We go up," I said. "To the plateau. The truck is on the logging road on the other side. It's our only chance." "I can't climb," David screamed. "My leg is useless." "You don't have a choice." I grabbed him by the collar, hauling him up. "Listen to me. If we stay here, we die. If we go out there, we might die. I'll take those odds. Do you hear me? I am taking the odds." He stared at me, trembling. Then he nodded, a small, broken movement. Okay. Here's the plan," I said, my voice dropping to a tactical whisper. "I'm going to use the revolver. It's louder, bigger flash. It might stun them for a second. I'm going to clear the hole. You go first. You scramble up the trail. I'll be right behind you, covering your 6. "Me first?" "Yes, because if I go first and you fall, I can't catch you. If you go first, I can push you. Move." I holstered the Glock and brought up the Ruger. It felt heavy, archaic. A cowboy gun for the end of the world. I moved to the barricade of bodies at the entrance. A gap had opened up at the top. A face was pressing through. A woman with no nose, just a gaping hole in the center of her face. I shoved the barrel of the Ruger into the hole. Boom! The sound in the cave was indescribable. It wasn't a noise. It was a physical blow. My ears popped. The flash blinded me, but the hole was clear. The .357 round had cleared the fatal funnel. "Go!" I shoved David toward the light. He scrambled over the pile of corpses, slipping on the blood. He gasped in pain as his bad ankle hit a rib cage, but he kept moving. He squeezed through the opening and onto the ledge outside. I followed him. The night air hit me like a slap. It was freezing, raining hard now. The wind howled along the cliff face. We were on the shelf, halfway up the climb. Below us, the cliff was alive. The flashlight beam cut through the rain, revealing a carpet of gray skin. They covered the rock face like kudzu. Hundreds of them. They were clustered at the cave mouth, confused by the sudden empty space, but they were already looking up. They saw us. A screech went up from the horde, a collective shriek of hunger that drowned out the wind. "Climb," I roared at David. He reached for the next handhold, dragging his crippled leg. I came up behind him, holstering the revolver and switching back to the Glock. I needed one hand free to climb, one to shoot. An infected man lunged from the ledge below, grabbing my boot. I kicked down, feeling his fingers snap, but he held on. He was heavy, dragging me off the wall. I looked down. He was grinning, his gums black and bleeding. He wasn't trying to climb. He was trying to pull me down. I aimed the Glock between my feet. Bang. He fell away, tumbling into the darkness. "Move, David. Move." We scrambled up the switchback. It was a nightmare of slick rock and grasping hands. Every shadow held a monster. Every slip meant death. David slipped. His good foot lost purchase on a mossy rock. He slid backward, crying out. I caught him. My left hand grabbed the back of his jacket, my fingers digging into the fabric. The sudden weight nearly pulled me off the wall. My right hand, holding the gun, scrabbled for a grip on the stone. I found a crack, jamming my fingers in until the nails threatened to tear off. "I got you," I grunted, my shoulders screaming in protest. "Find a foothold." "Kick," he flailed, his boots scraping against the stone, sparking. He found a ledge. He pushed up. We were 10 feet from the top. The rain was coming down in sheets now, cold enough to numb my fingers. I couldn't feel the gun anymore. I just knew I was holding it by the weight. Above us, the lip of the plateau loomed, a dark line against a slightly less dark sky. "Almost there," I yelled. A shape appeared at the edge of the plateau. I froze. They were already up there. They had flanked us. The shape looked down. It wasn't moving like them. It was low, quadrupedal. A wolf? A bear? No, it stood up. It was a man, but he was moving all wrong. His limbs were too long, disjointed. He shuddered, that violent vibration rattling his frame. He crouched, ready to pounce on David as he crested the rim. "Dave, wait!" I raised the Glock. It was a bad angle, shooting straight up. Rain in my eyes, the infected sprang. He didn't jump at David. He jumped over him, aiming for me. I fired blindly. Bang. Bang. One shot missed. The second hit him in the stomach. It didn't stop the momentum. He hit me. We slammed into the cliff face. The impact knocked the wind out of me. His hands cold, clammy. Strong grabbed my throat. His teeth snapped inches from my nose. I could smell him, the rot, the rain, the old death. I dropped the gun. It clattered down the cliff, bouncing away into the dark. I was unarmed, hanging off a cliff with a monster on top of me. My left hand was still gripping the rock. My right hand was pinned by his body. He leaned in, opening his mouth to tear my throat out. I headbutted him. It was a desperation move. My forehead smashed into his nose. Cartilage crunched. He reared back, his grip loosening for a microsecond. I ripped my right hand free. I didn't reach for a knife. I didn't have time. I reached for the flare in my cargo pocket. I ripped it out. I smashed the striker cap against the rock face. FZZZT. Red light exploded into existence, magnesium and sulfur burning at 3,000 degrees. I jammed the burning flare into his open mouth. He shrieked, a sound that wasn't human, wasn't animal, just pure biological agony. He let go of the rock. He let go of me. He clawed at his face, at the fire consuming his head. He fell backward. I watched him tumble down the cliff, a spinning star of red fire. illuminating the horror below. The light revealed hundreds of them, a sea of upturned faces, watching their burning brother fall. "Mark," David was reaching down from the top. "Grab my hand." I reached up. My hand was shaking, burned slightly by the flare's slag. I grabbed his wrist. He pulled. I kicked. We rolled over the lip of the plateau and collapsed onto the flat, muddy ground. We lay there for a second, gasping, the rain washing the blood and ash from our faces. We were alive. We were out of the cave. But we weren't safe. I rolled onto my knees, scanning the plateau. It was a flat expanse of clear-cut forest, stumps sticking up like gravestones. And about 500 yards away, across the open ground, was the logging road. And on the road, illuminated by the distant glow of the burning cities, was my truck, a 2018 Toyota Tacoma. Lifted, winch, off-road tires, salvation. But between us and the truck, the plateau wasn't empty. The flare I'd dropped had drawn attention. But it wasn't just the climbers. The woods on the other side of the road were moving. Shadows were detaching themselves from the tree line, dozens of them, hundreds. They were drifting onto the road, blocking the path to the truck. And in the distance, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze solid. Not a moan, not a hiss, the thrum of engines. Heavy, low-frequency throbbing. I looked south. 3 lights were moving through the sky, low and fast. Jets. Sterilization units, I whispered. They weren't here to rescue us. They were here to burn the infection out. I looked at David. He was staring at the truck, hope warring with despair in his eyes. "We have to run," I said, pulling the Ruger from my pocket. I had 6 shots left, a knife, and a brother who couldn't walk. "Mark," David said, pointing at the sky. "What are those?" "The end of the world," I said. "Get up, David. We have 1 shot." I checked the cylinder of the revolver one last time. "We make it to the truck, or we burn with the rest of them." I helped him stand. The rain poured down, washing away the old world, leaving only the mud and the meat. "Run," I said. And we stepped into the kill zone. We hit the mud running. Or rather, I ran, and David lurched, a 3-legged animal driven by the primal scream of the reptile brain. The rain was coming down in sheets now, a freezing curtain that turned the clear-cut plateau into a slurry of ash and clay. Every step was a battle against suction. My boots sank 6 inches deep, the mud grabbing at my ankles, trying to hold me in place for the gray tide sweeping in from the tree line. "Don't look at them," I roared over the wind, gripping David's bicep so hard I felt the muscle tear under the fabric. "Look at the truck. Eyes on the truck." He didn't answer. He was making a sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite breathing. A high, thin wheeze of exertion. His head was down, his good leg driving, his bad leg dragging like a dead weight. 500 yards. It doesn't sound like far. On a track, it's a minute and a half. In this terrain, with a cripple and a horde, it was a marathon through hell. The sky above us tore open. The sound wasn't a roar. It was a physical impact. 2 F-15 Eagles screamed over the plateau, flying so low I could see the afterburners glowing like eyes of fire in the gloom. They weren't banking. They were on an attack run. They were lining up on the ridge we had just left. The cave, the cliff, the crash site. "They're dropping," I shouted, though I couldn't hear myself. Behind us, the world turned white. There was no sound at first, just a flash that bleached the night, erasing the shadows, the rain, the trees. It was brighter than the sun. Then came the heat. A wave of thermal radiation slapped against my back, hot enough to singe the hair on my neck even through the rain. Then the sound caught up. Crump, boom. The ground jumped, actually jumped. The shockwave rolled through the earth, liquefying the mud beneath us. David stumbled, his bad leg buckling. We went down, sliding face first into the muck. "Get up!" I scrambled to my knees, spitting grit. I looked back. The ridge was gone. It was replaced by a wall of rolling orange fire. Napalm, or something newer, hotter. It was a sterilization strike. They weren't just killing the infected, they were burning the infection out of the soil. The fire climbed into the sky, a towering inferno that turned the raindrops into steam, and out of the steam they came. The fire hadn't killed them all. The horde on the plateau, the ones who had been waiting for us, were silhouetted against the flames. Hundreds of them. They were frantic now, agitated by the noise and the light. They weren't shambling, they were sprinting. A chaotic, surging wave of black shapes against the orange backdrop. "They're coming!" David screamed, clawing at the mud. "Mark, they're right there." I hauled him up. "The truck is right there." "Move." We were 200 yards out. The Tacoma sat on the logging road, its white paint reflecting the hellfire behind us. It looked pristine, a machine from a civilized world that no longer existed. But the woods on the other side of the road had emptied. The intercept group. They were spilling onto the gravel, blocking the path to the driver's side door. The math, I whispered to myself. Distance equals rate times time. Force equals mass times acceleration. I had 6 bullets. There were 20 infected between me and the door. "David, take the keys." I ripped the fob from my pocket and shoved it into his hand. "Go to the passenger side. Do not wait for me. Get in and lock the door." "What about you?" "I'm clearing the path. Go." I shoved him toward the right side of the truck. He stumbled away, limping toward the passenger door. I turned toward the driver's side, toward the 20 biological machines standing between me and salvation. I raised the Ruger. The heavy steel felt cold and reassuring. "Move!" I screamed at them. They didn't move. They hissed, their heads snapping toward me. The leader was a man in a fishing vest, his lower jaw missing, a tongue lolling out of the ruin of his throat. He shrieked and charged. I fired. The .357 Magnum round hit him in the sternum. It didn't just stop him. It threw him backward into the 2 behind him. Kinetic energy. Mass times acceleration. I kept moving forward, walking into the recoil. Bang. A woman in a tracksuit dropped, her head snapping back. Bang. A teenager lunged. I missed the head, hit the shoulder. The heavy slug spun him around, but he stayed up. He turned, snarling. Bang. I put the next one through his ear. 2 rounds left, 10 yards to the truck. The rest of the pack swarmed. They weren't attacking individually anymore. They were converging. A closing circle of teeth and hands. I heard the beep-beep of the truck unlocking. David had made it. I saw the passenger door fly open. He scrambled inside. "Mark!" he screamed from the cab. I was 5 yards away. An infected in a flannel shirt blocked the handle. He lunged for me. I fired my 5th round, point blank. His face disappeared. 1 round left. I reached for the door handle. Something hit me from the side. Heavy, wet. I went down. It was the one I'd missed, or one I hadn't seen. It hit me with the force of a linebacker, pinning my gun arm to the gravel. I smelled the rot, the old blood, the bile. I looked up into a face that was more scar tissue than skin. It snapped at my throat. I jammed my left forearm into its neck, holding it back. Its teeth gnashed inches from my nose. Spittle sprayed my face. It was strong, impossibly strong. The virus had turned off the limiters in its muscles. It was tearing its own tendons to get to me. I couldn't bring the gun around. My right arm was pinned under its knee. I felt its fingers digging into my jacket, ripping through the layers. It was going to bite me. It was going to infect me. And I was going to turn, and I was going to kill my brother. No. I bucked my hips, bridging hard. It threw the thing off balance for a microsecond. I ripped my right arm free. I jammed the barrel of the Ruger into its ribs, angling upward toward the heart. Click. Misfire? No. I'd lost count. Or I'd fired 6. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. The math had failed. The infected recovered. It roared, driving its weight down, crushing the air out of my lungs. Its mouth opened wide, descending toward my face. Then, a sound. Whack! The infected's head jerked to the side. A spray of black blood hit the gravel. It slumped, rolling off me. I looked up. The passenger door of the truck was open. David was leaning across the center console. The driver's side door kicked open. He was holding the tire iron from the emergency kit under the seat. His face was white, his eyes wild. He had swung it across the cab, through the open door, and cracked the thing's skull. "Get in!" he screamed. "Get in the goddamn truck!" I scrambled up. My lungs were burning. My arm was numb. I dove into the driver's seat. Hands grabbed my boots. I looked down. There were 3 of them on the ground, crawling out from under the chassis. They grabbed my ankles, pulling. "Kick!" David yelled. He was hauling on my tactical vest, pulling me into the cab. I kicked. I felt bones break under my heel. I scrambled backward, up into the seat. I slammed the door. Thud. A face pressed against the glass instantly. Then another, then 3 more. They were swarming the truck, covering the windows. A blanket of gray flesh. They hammered on the glass. The truck rocked on its suspension. "Keys!" I shouted. "Ignition!" David yelled back. I grabbed the key, jammed it in, and turned. The engine roared to life. The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. The glorious mechanical hum of a V6 engine. "Seatbelt!" I yelled, throwing the truck into drive. "Just drive!" I stomped on the gas. The Tacoma lurched forward. I felt the sickening thump-thump crunch of driving over bodies. The steering wheel jerked in my hands as the tires fought for traction on flesh and gravel. We plowed through the wall of infected. Bodies bounced off the hood. One clung to the side mirror, hammering on the glass, until I sideswiped a tree and tore him and the mirror off. We broke through. The road ahead was clear for 50 feet, illuminated by the high beams. I didn't let up. I kept the pedal pinned to the floor. The truck fish-tailed in the mud, spitting gravel, fighting for grip. "Are you bit?" I shouted, scanning the road, scanning the mirrors. "No, are you?" No, we were moving. We were leaving the plateau, but the sky wasn't done with us. "Incoming!" I yelled. Another pair of jets screamed overhead. Behind us, a second set of bombs hit the logging road. The shockwave hit the truck like a physical fist. The rear end lifted off the ground. The windows rattled in their frames. The rearview mirror was filled with a wall of fire that seemed to be chasing us, eating the road, eating the trees, eating the world. "Hold on," I fought the wheel, correcting the slide. We drifted around a hairpin turn, the back tires spinning over the edge of the drop-off, for a terrifying second before biting into the gravel. We shot down the mountain road, racing the avalanche of fire behind us. I drove like a man possessed. I used every ounce of training I had, apexing corners, feathering the throttle, managing the weight transfer. This wasn't a commute, it was an extraction under fire. We descended. The air grew thicker, warmer. The rain intensified, turning the windshield into a blur that the wipers couldn't clear fast enough. 10 minutes. 20. The glow in the rearview mirror faded, replaced by the suffocating darkness of the deep woods. The road leveled out. We hit pavement. Route 12. I didn't stop. I turned west, away from the fire, away from the city. The highway was a graveyard. Abandoned cars littered the lanes. Doors open. Luggage scattered. Bodies. I weaved through the wreckage, keeping the speedometer at 60. I didn't look at the bodies. I didn't look at the shapes feasting on them in the breakdown lanes. I drove until the fuel light pinged. I drove until the adrenaline crash hit me so hard, my hands started to shake uncontrollably. I pulled over on a bridge overlooking a river gorge. It was a high, defensible position, clear sight lines. I put the truck in park. I killed the engine. The silence rushed back in, ringing in my ears. I sat there, gripping the wheel, staring out at the rain. My chest was heaving. I smelled of sweat, cordite, and old blood. "We made it," David whispered. He was slumped against the passenger door, clutching his leg. His face was gray, washed out by the dome light. "Check the back," I said. My voice was a croak. "What?" "Check the back seat." He turned. It's just our packs and the rifle." I nodded. I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes. We were alive. I opened my eyes and looked at my brother. "You saved me back there, with the tire iron." David let out a breathy, hysterical laugh. I did the math. 2 is greater than 1. I managed a weak smile. "Yeah, the math." I looked out the window. To the east, the sky was starting to lighten, not with the sun, but with the false dawn of the burning horizon. The smoke column from the ridge was a black pillar holding up the sky, and beyond that, the glow of the cities, Seattle, Tacoma, Ellensburg, all burning. The radio in the dash was still on. Volume low. I reached out and turned it up. Static. Then, a loop. Emergency broadcast. Shelter in place. Government has been relocated to, God help us. Biological threat level black. Then silence. I turned it off. I looked at my hands. They were stained dark, not dirt. Blood. Some of it mine. Most of it theirs. "What now?" David asked. The panic was gone from his voice, replaced by a dull, hollow exhaustion. "Where do we go? The radio said the cities are gone, the army is gone." I looked at the map on the dashboard screen. It was frozen, no GPS signal. "We go north," I said. "Deep north, the Cascades, the Yukon. Somewhere cold, somewhere empty." "Why?" "Because the dead don't like the cold," I said, remembering the sluggishness of the infected in the rain. "And because there are fewer people. Fewer people means fewer of them." "And then what?" "Then we survive," I said, "day by day, bullet by bullet." I started the engine. The rumble was comforting, a heartbeat of steel and fire. "David," I said, putting the truck in gear, "check the glove box." "Why?" "Just check it." He opened the latch. Inside was a box of 357 Magnum rounds, a spare magazine for the Glock, and a Snickers bar. He grabbed the candy bar, his hands trembling. He tore the wrapper with his teeth and took a bite. "Ah." He chewed slowly, tears leaking from his eyes. "It's good," he choked out. "Save half," I said automatically. "For later." He nodded, wrapping the rest. I pulled the truck back onto the highway. We rolled past a family sedan smashed against the guardrail. Inside, I saw movement. A child, strapped in a car seat, thrashing against the restraints, snapping its teeth at the window. I didn't stop. I didn't look away. I just kept driving. The sun broke over the mountains. It wasn't a golden sunrise. It was red, blood red, filtered through the smoke of a million funeral pyres. It illuminated a world that was broken. A world that was hungry. I adjusted the mirror. The fire on the ridge was miles behind us now, just a scar on the horizon. We were the lucky ones. We were the survivors. But as I looked at the long, empty road ahead, stretching into the gray unknown, I realized the truth. The dying was the easy part. It was the living that was going to be the nightmare. "Day 2, I whispered. I pressed the gas. The truck surged forward, carrying us away from the ashes of the old world and into the cold, hard teeth of the new one.